thank you all for coming out to the talk today. As Jason mentioned, I'm going to give a talk today about framing research. And so before I get started, I just want to situate what I'm talking about, both in terms of productivity, as well as what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about how and where to frame your research. So with that said, right, as Jason mentioned, IHS has been putting on a number of these talks about how to be productive. And I'm not going to talk so much about actually doing the writing in terms of how do you keep yourself glued to your scholarship or where do you find ideas. But here, what I'm going to talk about is this idea that while you might have really good research, while you might have a project that is to you very interesting and important, and maybe even groundbreaking, sometimes it's hard to get others on board with this idea. And we don't get credit just for writing. We get credit for if that writing turns into publication. So what I want to talk about is one technique that I have found rather useful in trying to convince my readers, right? And in particular here, because I'm talking about publication in academic journals, those readers being editors and reviewers, right? Trying to get them to buy in on the project I'm working on. Now, I want to be clear at the onset here that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, which I'll talk about, which is that oftentimes we've conducted the research and then need to find a way to frame it to fit within the discussion or that we're interested in. But I'm going to suggest to you that the technique that I'm describing might actually be even better to start your research program with, right? It's going to give you the research questions that you might want to ask about your topic of interest. So with that in mind here, what I'm going to do is talk about what I see as the ingredients for publication, right? Are there certain components that might increase the likelihood of publication? Of course, not guaranteed, but what might help here. I'm going to focus on one of those in particular, which is framing. We'll define framing and talk about what that looks like. We'll talk about 3 types of readers that tend to get your manuscript when it goes out for review. And lastly, I'll finally get to kind of the punch of the talk, which is this idea of research questions versus research puzzles. And I'm going to suggest to you that puzzles are the better way to think about framing your research and setting up your research agenda, because they're going to not only highlight the importance and contribution of your research, but they're also going to inform you of which questions are the best ones to ask to get an understanding of your topic at hand. So with that in mind, what I wanted to do was think about, well, what are the factors or components that go into getting published, especially in academic journals. So here, right, to be clear, I'm not talking about how might you come up with research for a dissertation, or maybe even some differences between trying to publish books versus trying to publish articles. What I talk about today has implications for those as well, but here this is really about the journal process. And what I wanted to do was break apart what I see as the recipe for publication into parts that were kind of large chunks, which we could further disaggregate if there's interest, but also noting that those pieces do speak to one another and they're not purely independent, right? So for me, the idea is that publication starts with good research. Now, when I say good research, what I'm talking about here is largely what we spend most of our time talking about in training graduate students, right? This is how do you write a theory? How do you derive hypotheses? How do you collect data? Which estimators to choose? On and on and on, right? The things that we do, we spend a lot of time on. Now, in my mind, right, you're going to have this good research, which are the nuts and bolts of your project, but there's a part of good research that we don't often talk about in graduate school, at least in my graduate school experience. This was not something that we focused a lot on, but that's framing. Now, again, I'll come back to defining framing in a little bit, but for me, right, I didn't think about this idea that the research alone wouldn't be enough to get it published, right? The idea I had was, oh, well, you just, you have a strong theory, you drive some hypotheses, and you test them in the appropriate way, and that should be good enough, right? And it turns out that it might be, um, but journals have limited space, right? And it turns out that there might be a bunch of good research out there, and editors and reviewers are trying to make decisions on, well, which manuscript is actually going to make the cut to get that valuable space. And so it was framing that I think is going to help make that jump or help you clear that bar. And again, I didn't hear about this at the end of graduate school, and it wasn't really until a few years into me being an assistant professor that I really got a good understanding of framing and the technique that I'm going to talk about today, the research puzzle. Now, the third part of the publication equation is going to be luck, right? So for those of you who are working in quantitative methods, right, you might think about this as an equation for publications. It's good research plus framing plus some error turn, right? This luck. And again, we don't speak a lot about luck when it comes to graduate training. Part of this, I think, is because there's not a whole lot that we can do here, because luck might be, well, who happens to say yes to a review? How many other reviews are they doing that day? Right? How busy are they? What's going on in their life? How are they feeling that day? And there's been more and more research that points out that luck actually plays quite a large role in determining whether a manuscript gets published and where it gets published. So again, I'm going to set luck aside, but I do want to highlight, we don't, in my experience, what we do is we talk to graduate students about do good research, it'll get published, and we kind of don't discuss what are some of those other aspects out there. So again, what we're going to talk about here is just one of these ingredients, right, which is the framing. So what is framing? Well, a simple definition, and one that we're going to work with and then break apart as we move forward, is that framing is how you think about positioning your research project, right? That little nugget of good research that you have within the broader field. Now, oftentimes, when I see early research, especially graduate student research, I notice one of two issues. The first is that the scholar is writing just about one variable, right? And they want to tell a story about this variable that they find is rather interesting, rather than thinking about how that variable is part of a broader discussion. The other thing that I see is oftentimes what we have is the idea that the writer is trying to write in relation to a specific other paper or another author in particular. Now, in listening to some of this, some other talks on productivity, I understand that in some fields, this might be a way in which you can get a quick publication, right? A response article. In political science and the other related social sciences, oftentimes, though, this isn't enough. And even if it is, right, I think what this does is it disconnects you from the broader conversation or discussion that research is really aiming to focus on. So the thing that I think we lose sight of is that what we're really part of is this broad discussion across a number of different journals, perhaps some overlap in disciplines, and a number of different people, and everyone's trying to talk at once, right? And the idea is, well, how do we make sure that we're heard, right? How do we get to be part of that discussion by entering those academic journals, by getting published? And what I want to suggest to you is that the way to start thinking about framing is the temporal aspect of discussions, right? So people are going to speak before you and people are going to speak after you. So no matter how great your research project might be, it turns out that it's never a mic drop and the discussion ends, right? And again, when I think back to my graduate school experience and what I often see in graduate education is that when we talk about previous work, what we aim to do is talk about its limitations and its problems, right? We break it all down. And it's absolutely important to highlight where our field has issues, right? Has problems, has limitations. But I think this is also can lead to problems where we don't recognize that we're actually building on a conversation that's happening around us and that's happened before us. So think of an analogy to building a house. If you walk by a construction site and the foundation has been poured, and every day that you walk by the construction site, you take a sledgehammer to this foundation and say, well, everything is wrong. They didn't do it right. There's all these problems. Ultimately, the house never gets built, right? And so what, of course, if there's the foundation is all cracked and crumbly, if there's huge holes, then we do need to fix those. But I think a better way to think about what we're trying to do is to build, right? And so if you're thinking about building on that foundation, building on that previous research, then what you want to think about is then how do you clarify what should be the next step, right? Which boards need laid next in that house? So part of what you're going to do then is clarify your contribution and suggest if what I'm saying is correct, then here are some ways forward, right? I'm not ending the conversation. I didn't solve the problem all by myself, but rather this is the next steps that we can take to help in this process. Right? Oftentimes I hear discussions of, well, I don't have a counterintuitive theory or counterintuitive findings, and that's okay, right? If everything is counterintuitive, that means that our fields actually know very little about what's going on. Right? Again, it would be that foundation crumbling every time you or somebody else walks past this. Now, part of figuring out where you fit within that conversation, within that broader discussion across all these different journals, across time, right? It's going to be partially salesmanship, right? Absolutely. And the reason for that is because this conversation is that literature, right? It's that literature review. And what you're going to need to do is be able to construct that literature review to highlight where there is disconnection, right? Where there is this tension that you can solve, or where there are these places that we've yet to explore. And sometimes when we talk about literature reviews as salesmanship, I think this turns off aspiring scholars, right? The idea is that the research we're doing is pure, or it's good in itself because we really care about the ideas and want to advance it. I know this idea of salesmanship turned me off, right, when I first heard this idea of framing. But what I want to point out about framing and about the research puzzle that I will talk about in a little bit here is that it also forces us to think carefully about theory, right? If once we start lining up those planks of the house, we will see whether or not they actually fit together, right? In the same way, we might have a number of different claims in the literature that we accept, but do they actually work together? And if not, right, how can we better the discipline in which we're working? But there becomes a problem, right? Which is, well, who are you selling to? And again, here I'm not going to be talking about dissertation committees or your colleagues or even necessarily at a conference here, but rather who are you selling your idea to when it comes to getting your research published, right? When you want to move beyond having that strong nugget of good research and turn it into an actual publication. Well, it turns out that publication requires surviving both editors and reviewers. Now, for those of you who haven't had practice or knowledge about the publication process, what I want to do is just take a moment here to talk about what both the editor and reviewers do before thinking about three broader types of readers. So when you send your manuscript into a journal, it'll get a managing editor who figures out which of the editors should read the manuscript, and that editor is going to have the initial decision. They can desk reject your research, which means they simply say they're not going to move forward, right? They're not going to send it out for review. This might be because they don't think the research is good. This might be because they don't think it fits well within their journal, or it can be for a number of other reasons, right? So if you get the desk reject, you're moving on, you're no longer at that journal. If the editor decides to send your manuscript out for review, what they're going to do is select a set of reviewers. Again, this is where I mentioned that luck might come into play here. Right, so depending on the journal, they're going to pick 2, 3, 4, 5 reviewers, and these are going to be folks who are experts in your field or related to your field, right? And those reviewers are going to be asked to provide feedback on your manuscript. What they're also going to be asked to do then is to make a suggestion for what the editor should do. Now, it turns out that the most common suggestion is reject, right? Most articles get rejected. But if a reviewer decides not to click the reject button, then there's a host of other options that they can choose: major revision, minor revision, conditional acceptance, and on and on. And some of these reviewing and submission websites also ask reviewers to then rate their confidence, or the 10%, 50%, 90%, and on, right? And so in talking to editors, what I've learned is that for reviewers who don't select reject, it turns out that there's rarely agreement amongst all of the reviewers, right? And part of the reason for this is that there's no clear standard for what is a major revision versus a minor revision versus a conditional accept, et cetera, right? This is across journals and across reviewers. So what one reviewer may consider a major revision, another might consider a minor revision. Right? And then once you start adding in how confident they are, right, what this oftentimes then leads to is a situation in which editors are left to kind of divine what they should do from the tea leaves of all the reviewer comments and selections, right? So it can turn into a bit of a mess then for the editor to decide, is your paper really the one that should get this coveted spot within the journal? And so what I want to suggest then is how we might think about the editor and these different reviewers in terms of the types of readers they might be, to offer this technique, this puzzle that we will get to, that might help get them all on the same page, right? That will help you move at least beyond that reject into that area in which the editor will have some confidence that they should in fact offer you that chance to revise and resubmit. So when I talk about 3 readers, I don't necessarily mean, well, the editor is one, reviewer 1 is another, and reviewer 2 is the third. But rather what I'm thinking about are 3 types of readers. It turns out that we generally see 3 types of people who are in this process, whether they're an editor or a reviewer. The first is the less knowledgeable reader. So this is an individual who is an expert in their field. But if you think about the probability that the given editor does exactly what you do, right, it's quite low, right? So let's imagine that you're going to submit to a general political science journal and you study Civil War. Well, that editor might study comparative politics of Japan or American politics, right? And so let's say, okay, well, I'm going to send it to the International Relations Journal. Okay, well, the editor might study trade and you study Civil War. Well, I'll send it to the Conflict Journal. Okay, maybe they study interstate war and you study Civil War. Fine, I'll send it to the Civil War Journal. Well, you might study rebel mobilization and the editor might study post-conflict peace agreements, right? And so by the time you get there, you've already whittled way down the journals that you can send to, and you still don't necessarily have a perfect match between you and the reader, right? Same thing if you study education policy in Massachusetts, right? Maybe the editor also does education, but in North Carolina. Or maybe they do Massachusetts and not education, they do something else. Or maybe you do busing and they do textbooks, right? So the idea is that you're going to get readers who are invested in this process who might not come to the table with a good understanding of what you're doing. Now, the second type of reader is going to be the expert, right? So the idea is that the editor could be the expert, or might find a reviewer who's an expert, who's going to potentially take their time and begin reading slowly to pull apart the arguments you're making, right? They have time to dig into the details, and they're really going to be looking for you to make solid claims, right? We're going to compare the expert reader to the rushed reader. This might be an expert, it may not, but either way, they're reading rapidly, they're skimming, right? They might have a bunch of other reviews. They might have to, go to the store. They might have to teach a bunch of classes or grade finals or whatever it is, and they're trying to figure out how to allocate their time. And so they're not going to give you a whole lot of it. The problem, or one of the problems, is that many readers, whether they're an expert or not, whether they're reading fast or not, tend to make their decision by the end of the introduction. Now, I don't mean that these readers don't continue to read, but rather what they're doing is they're setting their priors, right? So they're going to read the introduction and say, well, this is probably not going to survive. Let's see. But if you're already starting there, right, it becomes quite hard to bring them up. On the other hand, right, they might set the price, hey, this is a pretty good article. I'm interested to see where it goes. Let's see if it survives, right? That gives you a much easier launching point for the rest of your article. Now, the problem is that you need to convince each of these readers about your work's quality and its importance in that introduction, right? And I'm going to suggest that each of these readers is often convinced by something that's slightly different, right? So each reader is convinced by a different item. And if you're trying to um, convince them within the introduction, this means you have quite limited space to get that done, right? So here's what you need to do. You need to accomplish these 3 tasks. The first is that you need to be able to grab a reader's attention. This is especially true for the less knowledgeable reader, right? They might not know the debates. They might not know the nuts and bolts. But if you can say, hey, look, this is something you should really pay attention to, right? Then that gets them thinking that this might be something worth sending out for review or suggesting revise and resubmit. For the expert reader, yes, you are going to have to talk about the merits of the previous research, as I mentioned, but you also will have to talk about what has been incorrect or incomplete. And lastly, for the rushed reader, what they really want to know is, okay, so what's the answer and how are you going to do it? Right, so we're going to try to highlight all 3 of these goals in as succinct a manner as possible, right? Again, because you're trying to do all 3 in 1 to 2 single space pages. And so this is where I think that the puzzle can really help. Now, before we get to puzzles, I want to back up a second here and talk about research questions. So a research question is something about the world, right? It's just a question about how the world works in some way. So why do some flags contain yellow? Why do we drive on the right-hand side of the road? Why is it dark outside right now, right? All of these are potential research questions. It turns out that there are tons of these. And I would suggest that most of them are neither interesting nor important, at least as seen through the eyes of editors and reviewers, right? And I will also note that just having novel data does not mean that your project is interesting or important. So I bring this up because I've been hearing more and more at conferences and graduate student workshops, the pitch is, well, I've got new data. And I want to note that I do think it's really good that we're increasing the methodological sophistication and rigor of our research. But this doesn't mean that just by having new data, we should pay attention to what you're doing. The reason for that goes to this process here of getting into academic journals. So it turns out that most journals are not publishing null results, which means then to get a publication, you have to have something that's statistically significant. For example, if you're doing quantitative research, what that means is either you have to have findings that are different than everybody else. But as I mentioned earlier, if you're constantly finding things that are different than what we expected, right? If everything is counterintuitive, then we actually don't know quite a lot. And I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to the discipline in the beginning, right? And I'm going to suggest that it's probably going to be pretty hard for you to find data that upends everything every time you write a paper, which means then that your new data likely puts you in the place where you're finding the same thing we've already found. And now you might say, well, the effect size is a bit different, right? Again, well, why should we publish that compared to other papers? The puzzle, though, I'm going to suggest to you helps grab a reader's attention, explain what's missing, and clarify why this research project is important all in one go, all right? So here's the puzzle. We've finally gotten to it. A research puzzle has 2 components. The first is an expectation about the world, right? How should the world work? Where this expectation comes from is from the existing literature, right? Based on all that research with all that great merit that's come before you temporally, right? How do we expect things to shake out? And then the second part of the puzzle is that we have a non-conforming observation, right? So this observation can come from your novel data, it can come from any data set, it can come from watching the news, listening to podcasts, reading secondary sources, interviews, it doesn't matter. But the idea is that you're trying to set up two things. The first is, well, here's how the world works. Dear previous scholars, you've told me this is it. And yet over here, I'm finding that the world isn't producing the outcome that I expect. Now, again, if I return to the quantitative folks in the room, you might say, yeah, well, sure, there's going to be, observations off the line. That's not so surprising. That shouldn't, and that's right. And so we're not looking just for any deviant observation, but one that forces us to rethink the theory, right? So this is, again, why salesmanship is really about understanding theory. I'm going to say to you here that the puzzle then, once you have this tension between existing understandings from the extant literature and this non-conforming observation, that puzzle is then going to give you the specific research questions to ask. Right? So if you start your research project with this puzzle, it's going to suggest, well, here are the interesting and important questions relative to the other questions that we could ask about the same dynamics or topic. So I'll give you an example here from international relations, right? As far back as we know, scholars and observers of international relations have asked, why do countries or why do states fight? And it turns out that we have all sorts of answers: territory, ethnic differences, and on and on and on and on, right? And so there becomes a problem if you frame your paper as, well, there's a gap in the literature, or there's something that's understudied. What you're really saying is, look, I just got another answer, right? I'm one item on this long list that continues to grow. And you're still faced with this problem. Well, why do we care? Why do we care about this gap? Why do we care that this particular variable is understudied? Right? Just by having a gap doesn't mean that it's important. It doesn't mean that this is really motivating for us to rethink our explanations up to this point. But with the puzzle, but by highlighting that tension between the existing understanding of how the world works and these observations here, what it does is it says, here's what the answers don't tell us, right? Not that there's a gap, not that this is understudied, but hey, we know a lot, but yet there's still a significant observation or a significant portion of observations that we're not capturing with this theory. So we need to go back and explain not only these observations, but also the ones that we thought we could previously explain. So, in this example from international relations, James Fearon did this in 1995 in his Rationalist Explanations for War, where he says, look, we have this question why states fight, but that's not really puzzling. There's all sorts of reasons you'll fight. What's puzzling is why they can't avoid the cost of war, right? They know war is costly, and yet they continue to fight rather than settle. And yet, most interstate wars end in settlement rather than complete military victory for one side over the other. Right? So in this setup through the puzzle, right, he's saying, look, there's a whole bunch of answers out there, but there's importance here. We don't actually understand war because we don't understand how states are making this calculation between the cost and the decision to fight. It highlights why previous answers were incomplete here. There's no focus on costs, and it clarifies his approach. He's going to focus on costs, right? Both why states might accept those, thinking about the commitment problem, or why they simply might get the cost wrong. This information problem that's part of that paper there. But there's a trick, right? Which is that, that this research, again, is happening over years, over decades, and maybe even longer for you. And so in most disciplines, what we have are major puzzles that everyone knows to talk about, right? Maybe it's what Locke really means or what Plato was trying to say over here, right? Maybe it's something about the effectiveness of taxing or how firms work under uncertainty, right? There's a lot of major puzzles, and you can return to those. But since the field has been working on those for quite a while, oftentimes what you also need to be able to do is identify a direct puzzle that flows from these major puzzles or avenues of research within your discipline or within your subfield. So I'll give you an example of the way that this has developed in the literature on civil war, right? So we go back to Fearon and we say, okay, we understand that states are trying to avoid these costs, but in the case of civil war, it's often the time that foreign countries choose to intervene, right? The war is not to them and they decide to jump in. So the major puzzle that has been a focus of the work on intervention in civil war has been, why do states intervene given those costs? And the answer that's been offered is, well, these countries are trying to prevent future direct costs, right? They don't want to see influxes of refugees or arms flows or illicit markets, et cetera, right? So they get involved because they're experiencing these direct costs and they want to stop them. But flowing from that major puzzle or that larger puzzle, what we've seen is a shift in the literature now with a direct puzzle that comes out of this temporally, which says, okay, so states do intervene to prevent direct costs, but there's also states that intervene when they're not experiencing refugees, arms flows, rebels crossing borders, et cetera. What are they doing? And the answer has been given that really we have to rethink what costs are. Turns out that indirect costs matter as well. Right? So the idea is that this direct puzzle about indirect costs connects to the puzzle above it, which is about direct costs, which links to the puzzle about that, which is, well, not intervention, but the actual onset of war. So to summarize the difference between puzzles and questions, the idea is that a puzzle has two parts: an understanding of how the world works, given the existent literature, and then an observation that does not fit, right? And so the question might be, well, how do we know which of these observations aren't just blips off the line, which actually matter, right? So what you're looking for are observations that have the characteristics or the factors that we tend think explain or give rise to the data generating process. And yet, despite having those characteristics, despite having those factors, this observation isn't fitting. Right? So the puzzle is going to force us then to think carefully about our contribution and think carefully about this literature because it's showing them that tension. Now that puzzle, because you've identified where the existing literature has not been convincing and explaining how the world works, then gives you a series of questions that you should ask, right? Or that are the ones that are important to ask to solve your puzzle. Right? So the question then helps clarify the behavior in the puzzle. And I would suggest to you as well that what you want to ask are a series of why questions. Right? Sometimes we get questions which is like, well, how does X affect Y? Right? Or how much does X affect Y? And so when you ask questions like that, right, you're presupposing that this relationship already exists. But when you ask a why question, that allows you to posit an answer to a puzzle that you aren't, you haven't been sold on those previous explanations, right? It allows you to be the voice entering that ongoing discussion that gives an answer here. So just to recap what we've talked about in the last half hour is that I believe there are a series of ingredients for publication, right? I try to break these into broad groupings, but what I wanted to point out is that we really focus on the nuts and bolts of research in graduate education. I think this is really important, but one of the things that we often don't focus enough on is framing, right? How is it that we can try to get an editor and a set of reviewers to think that our research is worth that valuable space in that journal? I suggest that part of the problem is that there are three different types of readers who are going to be looking at your manuscript, and they're all looking for something different. And I suggest that a puzzle is a way in which to bring all three readers onto the same page to help move your research beyond that reject category into getting one of those revise and resubmits. Of course, this is only one technique. We can talk about others, but I think it's one that really helps sharpen our understanding of the literature and our understanding of existing theory as well as our own theories when it comes to pitching these ideas. So I will stop there for now, and I look forward to your questions.
Professor Uzonyi, thank you. So we do have a good queue of questions, and we will continue taking questions as we proceed. So feel free to open up the Q&A box and drop those questions in as we get started. So to begin with, one of the common questions here is if you could speak specifically to how this framework works, might need to be adjusted for more qualitative research.
So I was using the language of quantitative analysis just because it's what I do, but also I think it's just helpful to think about a formula like you have an outcome you want, and then there's a set of things that go into it. But I want to be clear that the suggestion of the puzzle is not limited to quantitative research at all. So if you're thinking about qualitative research, it's the same thing, right? So you're going to be in discussion with a field or a discipline that's been asking questions or maybe even asking puzzles and answering them for years, right? And so what you're looking for is, well, given all this scholarship, which again, you're going to treat as having merit, how is it that you expect the world to work? So if I expect the world to work a certain way, and again, I'm reading the newspaper or watching the news, listening to podcasts, having interviews, secondary sort of whatever it is, I'm going to start to say, well, wait a minute. There are some of these cases that seem like they should work, just like the literature is telling me it should, and it's not. Right? So the puzzle is exactly the same. It's finding an observation that should work given this existing literature that has great merit, and yet it doesn't.
Great, thank you. Is it better to frame the previous research as being incomplete or incorrect?
Yeah, so this might be one of those it's easier to catch flies with honey things, right? So it could be the case that those are the same things. And let's imagine they are, right? And you start off with, well, you're all wrong, and here's why, right? Or you didn't do all this stuff right. Well, already remember what the editor is trying to do is pick reviewers who are experts on the subject. And one of the ways they do that is they look who you cited and they ask those people for your feedback, right? And I've talked to a couple managing editors. So these are the individuals who are responsible for linking manuscripts to reviewers. So the editor sometimes is not even part of this process. Sometimes they are, it depends on the journal. And the managing editors tell me, yeah, we read the introduction. Who are the people you're saying have the problem? And we send it to them, right? So, you know, think about which way that might lead them to consider your manuscript. Now, that said, again, I think the puzzle can actually help in this regard, because what you're saying is, hey, I expect the world to work a certain way, and I find something that doesn't fit. And so you don't say, well, what's wrong with the literature? You say, what's wrong with this case? And what's wrong with this thing over here? You guys, you've done great, but what about this? And once I can build a theory that can talk to this case, my hope is that it's not a theory that's only about this case, but rather just, it clarifies why we've been looking at the theory in a way that doesn't help capture as much of the world as potentially we could. And so in that way, yeah, the existing literature was incomplete, but it's because they haven't taken the angle you've taken to thinking about merging those deviant observations with how we expect the world to work.
So Joao asks, how should we present the gaps in the literature? So there might be cases where we want to say something like, no one has ever studied this problem, or only a few people have done so, but that feels risky because of the gaps in our own knowledge and our inability to speak to everything that's been discussed. So what's your approach to framing the actual gap in the literature?
Yeah, so I would not use the word gap, right? When I hear gap, the first reaction I have is, okay, there's almost infinite. I don't know if there are infinite. They're almost, right? It's like, oh, yeah, there's little things out there, and it turns out that sometimes those get published. But this goes back to what I was mentioning about, you don't want to write about a particular variable, right? Or a particular gap that no one's talked about. What you want to think about is, how does that gap or that variable, that thing that you're interested in, how does that tie to broader discussions, right? So I'll give you an example from my own graduate school experience. Is early on, I talked a lot about refugees, specifically when thinking about the connections between the diffusion of work across states. And it wasn't until later that I realized, if I'm only writing about refugees, then I'm largely only speaking to those other scholars writing on refugees. And maybe that is a large community, but I can attract more readership, right? I can increase the individuals who are interested in this if I talk about refugees as being a class of a larger category. The cost of conflict, right? Or maybe humanitarian concerns more broadly. So instead of saying, well, look, I found this one thing that no one's talked about, what I would suggest is that you use the puzzle to say, hey, there's these case of observations that if we actually kind of spin our angle on things, we can understand how to explain both what is that potential gap and what we've talked about already. So again, you're increasing readership and you're increasing buy-in from readers who might be working on topics that are somewhat similar, but aren't exactly the same. So the idea, again, is a gap limits you, whereas a puzzle allows this broader conversation.
So a couple questions about reviewers. First of all, because many times our articles will get sent to folks, with whom we disagree, or whose ideas we might challenge, how is it that we should frame our papers so as to not annoy them, or give our papers the best shot at getting an R&R or an acceptance from them?
Sure. So I think that the answer here combines two things that I was mentioning. The first is that you don't want to write your paper as a response to somebody else. Again, I understand that there is some discipline specifics here where this might work, at least for smaller articles. But again, think about this as a discussion. If what you say is there's generally people who argue, some range of the following, and you have a whole bunch of citations in there, what I find is that myself or other people, I think, will say, okay, yeah, you know what? I am a group of people and we do approach things this way. And that doesn't mean that I'm wrong, right? But perhaps I'm part of a group thinking about this in one particular way, that we should be more open to the way that you're pitching, right? So part of it is not writing about somebody or a particular paper, but rather about the topic more broadly. The second thing here is about going again about how you say this. It's not that they're all wrong, right? It's that, hey, they've had some merit in explaining the world in this way, but it turns out that we're not fully there, right? And I think that most scholars recognize that, right? It's not, I don't know of a paper out there that has gotten all of the observations, right? Or it can explain the entire world. And part of this, I think, is that we oftentimes feel like we have to defend our piece of the puzzle without recognizing that what we're actually doing is, there's like, so if I'm working on, let's say, government violence during civil war, well, this is only one aspect of political violence more broadly, right? And if you're able to say, hey, look, people have said this about government violence, well, how about the rebels? Or how about foreign countries, right? Or how about in the post-war period? Right, then I feel, then I as the previous scholar say, hey, I see how I can fit here. So again, if you're not coming at the person saying, hey, you're wrong, everything you did was wrong, I do think that in fact reviewers are open to considering how you are building from their research as part of your research.
So the next question continues the theme about dealing with the reviewers. How much do you try to shape the persons who will be selected as your reviewers? Do you ever strike reviewers whenever you submit the paper? Do you go in strategically in thinking about the folks who are cited early on in the paper in that regard?
Yeah, so I've never asked for somebody not to be a reviewer. There might be good reasons for that. So I'm not going to make a suggestion that you don't do that. I have heard that if you suggest reviewers, that a managing editor does take that suggestion seriously. So it's not just like something that you can spend time on in the review process. They do look at it. It's not guaranteed that you'll get those. But what I do is after I've written, after I've thought about the framing and I have the puzzle and I see who those citations are. And by the way, I cite the people that I'm trying to speak to, right? So again, it's not, hey, you, but these are the people who work on it. Those are the people I've got to talk to, right? Again, this is a discussion. And so what I do is I ask those people to read the paper, right? And so, I started this as a graduate student. You don't need to have these connections. You have to form the connections. And the one way to do that is to simply ask people, will you read my paper, right? So the way I do that, by the way, is I send them an email, Dr. So-and-so, my name is Gary, I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I'm working on this topic, and I draw a lot from your research on the same topic. And so I have this manuscript, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to provide some feedback on what I'm doing here, right? And the most common answer I got was yes, right? And the worst that they say is no. I've never heard anybody, or I've never received an email that was like, absolutely not, why'd you ever ask me to do this, right? Sometimes people don't respond. I would send a follow-up email after 2 weeks up to a month, but sometimes they don't respond and you move on. Now, with that said, I think that's valuable for a couple of reasons. One is that you get their feedback, which again, if that's a discussion you want to be in, you might as well have the people who are the leading names or who are at least active in the topic provide you feedback. Sometimes our own departments are too much of a bubble, so it's good to move outside of those. Another reason for that is I thank them in the letter to the editor. I say, hey, look, these people have read it. Now, my understanding is that that means that sometimes editors will say, well, then I can't send it to those people. And other times they'll say, okay, well, if you did send it to them, let's see what they'll say now. So if you're strategic, like, so if you're thinking about this strategically, and if you don't want people to be able to be a reviewer, maybe you thank them. I've heard that works. I'm not sure. But the other thing is, if you're thinking strategically and they've read it and you've actually made the revisions that they've asked you to make beforehand, well, then you're already doing half the review process.
So we have a question here that's a little bit more in the quantitative side of things. So is it the best practice to construct your puzzle around the outcome variable or the explanatory variable?
Yeah, so I've seen both and I've done both, but I got a review back recently which said, hey, you did this around the independent variable. It needs to be around the dependent variable. Now, one of the things I'll mention is that, so I'm here at the University of Tennessee, who now hosts the International Studies Quarterly, right, the ISQ, which is the flagship journal of the International Studies Association. So I'm right down the hall from the editors of that journal, and they're rather clear on this, that they prefer the framing to be around the dependent variable. And so the advice that I give is, if you can frame this around the dependent variable, that's better than around the independent variable, because it makes clear what you're trying to explain in the world, right? Yeah, you can do the independent variable, but it's almost like you could regress the independent variable against anything, right? Or with anything. Whereas the puzzle is really saying, hey, look, there's something about the world that we're not quite sure why it's happening this way. How do we explain why it's happening that way, right? And in that language, well, then you are talking about the dependent variable. I'll just mention, so ISQ, the other thing that they mention is, they do look at what you're saying with the independent variables, right? Because this is the International Studies Quarterly, and yet it publishes Civil War and stuff like that. And part of the reason for this is, as long as there's some kind of connection to what we traditionally think of as IR, even if it's on the right-hand side or even if it's in the literature, right? And that's enough to get over that hurdle. But framing around the dependent variable seems to be their preference. And I also agree that from the perspective of the puzzle, it is usually where you would go.
Stan asks, okay, I'm a theorist and I'm submitting a paper to a top-tier journal like the APSR, let's say. How much space should I devote to hooking in a general reader or non-specialist on this research puzzle, especially for parts of the discipline that already think that political theory is pointless?
Yeah, so I'll mention, as you move general, I had in the very beginning of the talk, I had said, well, there's this luck component, and more research is showing that this error term is actually quite large for where you get published. And it turns out where it's largest are in general journals. And the reason for this is not because, hey, we're the best journals, but because of what they try to do with reviewers, which is they do try to find people who are more far apart, because they're hoping that you're speaking to a larger audience, right? And so the problem is, as you move further apart, that means there's less understanding of what the nuts and bolts of this particular area of research are, and thus more concerned about, is this important enough for the pages of whatever. Now, the answer to your question, I think, is that the idea behind the puzzle is that it will attract readers who, even if they are less knowledgeable, can understand why something's important for politics, right? If this is political science or economics or whatever you're focused on. So you don't necessarily have to say something like, well, this particular political theorist really speaks to how we understand, trade, and how we understand the comparative politics of Ghana, and how we understand war in 1400s Latin America. No, you don't have to do all that, right? You're talking about something in politics, and the puzzle, right, by setting up this tension between what we know and what we observe is my idea, and why this would help even the less knowledgeable reader get over that hurdle. But I want to be just one last thing here is, remember that most of these journals have editors, the associate editors, right? They're kind of field specific. So it's not that the editor, especially at these large sort of field level journals, are going to be the person doing this, right? But they're going to say, oh, you're writing political theory, or you're writing on this particular topic. We're going to let that associate editor make the subsequent decisions, right? Which means they're trying to reduce that gap between them and you needing to convince everybody in the entire discipline on your
What's your advice for graduate students in terms of the sorts of questions that they should ask and the ambition with which they should pitch their research interests? So all things being equal, is it better for graduate students in the papers that they write initially to try to address smaller questions that are, important but more manageable, or should they really try to swing for the fences and aim to answer the huge questions in the discipline?
So I don't think that this advice is graduate student specific. So there's two parts of this in my mind. The first is that largely there's always this aspect of time in the back of your mind until I hear you're a full professor. I don't know that yet, right? But the idea is, look, I'm in graduate school and I've got to get on the market at certain, my funding runs out, my department kicks me out, I have home pressures that are requiring me to get a job, whatever it is. And in today's market, right? So especially if you're trying to get to a research university, you need publications to even get a look. So there's always this time pressure, which suggests then that it's probably a mixed strategy is the best, right? You're going to send out some things that you think have a good chance of getting published more quickly, right? And other things that might take longer to develop or might need to move to a couple different journals before they hit, right? Or might face more resistance. Again, same for assistant professors. Hey, you've got to get X number of publications before you're up for tenure, right? And so on and so forth. So the first part of that answer is it's largely about timing, right? And thus leading to this kind of mixed strategy. But the other thing is that I hear this, well, I'm taking on a big thing versus small thing. And oftentimes I think that this is in the framing of the puzzle, right? In the sense that, there are going to be connections, going back to that question about theory, political theorists, that we all might kind of be thinking about in terms of politics, and there might be others that are more specific about what do refugees do in this particular area. But again, if we're thinking about here's what the existing literature tells us, and here's things that aren't being answered by it, well, your approach should be as novel as possible to thinking about that disconnection, right? So that disconnection can be at these broader conversations, it can be more narrow, right? The feasibility, I don't think, really comes from the topic that's being discussed. But oftentimes, I think what we're seeing is kind of this move towards, not only having the puzzle, but having other stuff that other people. So we're seeing a lot more novel methodology, yes, novel data, to attach to that puzzle, and that's how you kind of move up to different tiers of the journals.
Sylvia asks if there are any examples of articles that you think do an exceptional job of applying these techniques.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the one that I gave the example of here, which was on Fearon's 1995 Rationalist Explanation for War. Now, one thing I'll mention about this is that in setting up the puzzle, he actually takes several pages. It isn't as succinct. And part of the reason, well, I can't speak to why he did that, but one of the things that's going on in the discipline, at least for political science, and my understanding is that this is not political science specific, but academic journal publishers are facing the crunch and the stresses of publishing today in terms of getting readership, right? And so they are shrinking the pages of journals and what can be published in hard copy. And since these journals still want a hard copy out there, that means they're either taking fewer articles or shrinking the size of the publication. So, political science, I remember starting graduate school and it's like, 14,000 words, 16,000 words. Now it's like everything's 10,000, right? And then there's a few that deviate from there. So he takes a bit more time. Now, if you want current articles that do this well, I would have to think about that a little bit. There are lots that do that, but I don't have a list handy, and I would like to be able to give you a more complete answer to that than I can do off the top of my head.
Are there any other resources that have shaped your thinking in terms of good approaches to either research puzzles specifically or the broader research process?
Yeah, so the resources that I use weren't textbooks or necessarily readings on these topics, right? And the reason for that goes back to what I mentioned in discussing the ingredients for publication, is because my graduate training was, hey, let's get a hypothesis, let's test it, right? Hey, you test it well enough, it gets published. And so again, it wasn't until I was almost out of graduate school, it's the year I went in the market, I heard some faculty members talking amongst themselves about framing. Like, well, what's this? Oh, we're trying to sell this article. Oh, you're selling it. That means it must not, right? And it wasn't until actually a couple years later that this got a return to this, and it was explained to me by a number of different people at a number of different times in different ways about what we're really trying to do in the introduction, what we're really trying to do with the literature review, right? And so again, this was more organic in these discussions for me that happened much later than hopefully they're happening for you. But because of that experience, no, I did not rely on specific resources to discuss framing or puzzles.
So we have several just sort of general research and productivity oriented questions. The first is just asking if you could talk a little bit more about how literature reviews apply with this framework.
Yeah, so the puzzle is your literature review. So I remember being in graduate school and we'd read a lot of articles from the early 1990s, right? Where what they would do is have an introduction and then they have this really long literature review that said the exact same thing as the introduction, right? And we can't do that anymore because of those pressure, those word count pressures as they increase, or as the pressures increase and the words decrease, right? And I actually think this is a good thing because I had no idea why I was reading the literature twice, right? So that's a personal preference. But what that means for today is if you're thinking about the literature, what you need to do is think about, well, what is the literature or what's the discussion that I want to speak to, right? And that literature then sets up the existing expectations that you're going to draw from, right? So for me, right, a literature review these days is a paragraph, maybe two, right? So what you have is just a paragraph, maybe two of the literature. You have a discussion of the case that doesn't fit, and then you give your answer for how you are going to answer that puzzle, right? Following your answer, oftentimes though, what journals do ask you to do, or reviewers ask you to do at least, is then to explicitly state what the contribution would be from moving forward. So there, when you're talking about moving forward, you're able to add in a bit more of the literature saying, hey, these people have done this great stuff, but if you also take what I'm saying, then we should also do the following, right? And so you can add in a bit more of the literature there as well. But lengthy literature reviews are a waste of space when you're trying to write a publishable article, right? For dissertations, they can be longer. For books, they can be longer, but not for the article. And I guess I should also mention in the last section of the paper, which we didn't really speak about here today, the discussion conclusion, right? That's where you can also come back to the literature and again say, well, here's how they were thinking about it. Here's what I suggest, and here's what that would mean moving forward. So you get that whole temporal aspect to the discussion in one place.
How do you deal with unreasonable referees, in particular in cases where the editor doesn't provide clear instructions on how to handle an R&R?
Yeah, so my approach is to try to do everything that the reviewer says, right? So how unreasonable it is, I don't know your particular case, but my thinking is if I can at least try, that's going to make the reviewer more happy than if I didn't try. It's going to make them happier than if I didn't try. So that said, right, so one of the things that when you're talking about unreasonable reviewers, right, so I think that sometimes what the reviewer is wanting either doesn't fit with what the other reviewers want. And then what you could do at that point is say, look, reviewer one has said this and reviewer two has said that. And I've attempted to do both, or you can say I've decided to go with whomever over the other one for these reasons, right? And so the idea is that you want to be signaling both to the reviewers and to the editors that you're taking their suggestions seriously. You have attempted to do them. And where there's disagreement, right, you're citing a reviewer. You're saying it's not just me, it's these people as well who agree with you. Now, I had one just the other day that said, so I was writing on genocide, and one reviewer, or actually the reviewer says, on one hand, genocide is very specific. It has nothing to do with any other type of political violence, right? That's the first comment. The second is, explain how your discussion or your paper on genocide speaks to all this other political violence literature, right? So what do you do there? You try to do both. Yes, the reviewer is right. This is specific, but yet I do think it has some implications, right? So again, the idea is try as best as you can and signpost as much as you can about how you have done, thank the reviewer. This is great. Here's what I tried. think it tends to work.
So we will have time for just a few more questions. And because we've been moving through these quickly, we actually have some time for additional questions. So if you have those, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. Our next question is from Alicia, who asks, is it essential to wait until you've collected data before writing articles in the process?
So, okay, so if you're asking about the puzzle, no, right? The reason for that is because you might get the observation that is non-conforming from somewhere other than collecting data, right? Maybe so this happened, I go to the library to get a book on the Congo, and I'm looking for something that happened rather specifically that I want to double check. Oh, wait, something else happened. I didn't think that's how this played out, or I didn't also know that. All of a sudden, that can become one of these observations I'm talking about, right? Because we expect the Congo to happen in certain ways, and hey, look, part of the story doesn't work the way we expect it to. So yeah, I didn't need to collect any data to find that puzzle. Again, it could be you're listening to the news and somebody, they're talking about trying to hold post-conflict justice for the Tigray population in Ethiopia, and you're saying to yourself, well, really, that's not how I understand post-conflict justice to happen from the literature. Right now, potentially the politicians don't have it right, potentially the literature doesn't have it right, but let's try to figure out which it is. It's a puzzle. Now, if your question is like, would I write an entire paper and then collect the data? No. And the reason for that is it turns out that sometimes, or many times, the answers that I think would turn out to be right are not supported by the data, right? Maybe they're null hypotheses, but again, not usually published. So I don't think it's a great use of your time to write an article without having some of the data collected. Now, of course, here's the tension, is that how you collect the data should be specific to your theory, right? And so there is this little bit of, well, the way I approach it is I sketch out the theory to the point where I'm pretty clear on what the data collection will need to look like to do this properly. I then collect the data and do those initial tests and see if I'm anywhere in the ballpark, right? And if I'm not, well, you move on. And if there's some questions, right, then you can think about, well, is the theory need some modification, or do I need to rethink how I've collected this data or the approach I'm using to analyze the data?
Nick asks how you know when you are ready to submit a paper.
Yeah, so the one thing that I see a lot of is folks just being worried about, am I ever going to be ready? And I do want to just point out to you, before I give you a more specific answer, is that if you think about publication the way I do, where you have this this publication equals the following plus error, that means you might have all the boxes checked, and then all of a sudden the error term gets you, right? Like, so you're never going to be 100%. This is perfect. Let's get it out there. And so what I tend to do is write the article, ask some close colleagues for some feedback, just to make sure there is no low-hanging fruit that could trip me up. Part of that process might be presenting it. Now, of course, we have this weird thing where you're proposing a paper like 6 months or more in advance. The paper might have died. You might have already moved on from it, whatever. So the conference might fall where that works. But once I get that initial feedback and I tighten up the paper based on that, that is when I then go and ask for outside readers' opinion. My number is 5. If I can get 5 folks who either I know slightly or not that well, who are willing to read this paper and provide feedback, once I've addressed their reviewer style feedback, I then say, look, if I increase that number, I'm probably not going to get a lot different feedback. Again, this is this idea that if it's issues that keep coming up, right, then those are the ones you want to focus on. At that point, I send it off, right? And I'm going to get rejected more than I'm going to get accepted. After a while, right, you get used to that. And then right, you move forward.
So our last question deals with what's going on in the minds of reviewers. So can you just sort of unpack how reviewers tend to approach the process of evaluating a paper and what's going on in their minds, ideally, for those with goodwill, as they go through this process?
Sure. And Jason, on that last point, I think oftentimes we talk about reviewers as like they don't know anything or they're out to get me. You know what I mean? But I actually think that reviewers generally are out there for goodwill. But I do think there is a little bit of a catch where it's this idea that, oh, I am the guardian of the journal now, right? And so like, I really got to make sure just the best get out there. And I've reoriented my own thinking on this, which is, look, I'm going to make suggestions about how this paper can get improved, but I don't know if this is a minor revision or a major revision for this individual. And so the idea is, I'm going to tell the editor, look, I think with this set of revisions, this could be worthwhile. Now, I don't know if other reviewers do that. When I've asked other folks, some say yes, some say no. But I just want to mention that I do think that reviewers are taking the job seriously, some more so than others, but I wouldn't enter the process saying they're out to get. I think that'll just already make it harder for you. So the way that I approach this, and the way that I believe others do from conversations with other people about this, is that reviewers are looking largely for three things, right? They're looking to see if you actually have a research puzzle. Now, they might not call it a puzzle, but the idea is, are you addressing something that we don't know, right? They don't want you to say the same thing that we've already heard a whole bunch of times. They then want to know, does your theory actually make sense, right? So yes, they might pick it apart. They might say, hey, what about these mediators? What about these modifiers? What about this condition over here? What about the data you collect, right? There might be all these what ifs, but at the same time, generally, like, does this make sense? Do I buy what's being sold? And then it moves to the analysis, which is then that's, again, kind of a checklist of, okay, here I'm going to use the language of quantitative analysis, but it's the same for qualitative. Is the unit of analysis right? Is the dependent variable what I think it should be from the theory? Is the independent variable map onto what the hypothesis is saying? Does the process of the data collection, does it make sense? Does the estimator make sense, right? So it becomes a checklist. So to get published, what I think some of the big hurdles are is that we're just not convincing that this needs to be published, right? So again, even if you have good research, there's a bunch of other good research out there. And so how is it that yours gets selected, right? That's that puzzle, that's the introduction. The second is, it turns out that I think oftentimes our theories make more sense to us than they do to readers. Or if you have the time to sit down and talk with your audience, they can understand your theory better. And I think this is actually somewhat of a problem when you think about committees, where you sit down, you're talking to your advisor, you're talking to your committee members. And so when they read what you write, they've also got all this back information that you don't necessarily get if you're the reviewer, right? And so one of the big hurdles is simply making sure that that theory, that you can walk through that theory and it just makes sense to someone who has very little context from where it came. And lastly, you do need to have your analysis of the theory be strong, right? You can't come up here with bad analysis, bad methodology, and assume that a reader can say, well, the story was good, right? That usually doesn't fly these days. And I do think that when it comes to the methodology, there is more of a checklist that reviewers are looking for. Again, if you just think about putting together a research design, it's much more straightforward than putting together a theory, right? Because certain things need to happen for a test to be a strong test or a good test of the theory. And again, I could talk about that, but I don't want to take up everyone's time talking about research design.
Yeah, great, thank you. Professor Uzonyi, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for presenting this. I think we will all get great use out of it.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for the questions, and thanks for sitting through it.